pretty sort of saltbush Billy. And it's a bit Carl too, because Carl was bopping along to Gundagai. Thanks for coming in, Carl.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And thank you for getting me all interested in Eric Jolliffe, because I mean I've obviously seen his stuff, but didn't know about the man.
Yeah, I was the same. I never knew him as Eric. I always knew him as Jolliffe. And basically for me, I'm in my mid-40s now, and I lived in the western suburbs of Melbourne, in Footscray. And it was a pretty tough neighbourhood, and I never got to go to school camps for whatever reason. Mum could never afford it, but I stumbled on this one comic one time. I think it might have even been a knob shop, and I bought this comic, and it just had me hooked. And I learnt so much about, I wouldn't have called it out back then as a kid, but just the way bush people did things. And then I had and we lived in a housing commission at 20-storey buildings they were, and there was an old bloke next door, and I said, have you ever, he goes, I've got piles of those, and he would just tell me for hours on end stories of his youth, and it reflected in the Saltbush Bill, and then obviously and then I started collecting these magazines, and that's what they really were to me, sort of like a little paperback magazine, quite cheap to make, I guess, and I had, until I moved to Darwin 7 years ago, I had every copy nearly of a Jolliffe cartoon that could get. Unfortunately, I wasn't pre-warned about what mould does to things. I lost the whole lot. And I won't lie to you, I cried because my childhood was there, and you've got a couple that I could save.
Yeah.
You see, when I was young, I would colour bits in and bits and pieces, and then my daughter was the same, would colour in a pelican or whatever. But they taught me a lot, actually, about bushland.
Yeah, about the old Australia.
Yeah, like for example, you'll get a young person go, you drive all the way from Adelaide to here, you're crazy, I wouldn't do that. And I think, well, it wasn't only 100 years ago, blokes rode horses, and that would have been tough.
So did you just love the way he drew? Because he did cartoons, didn't he?
Yeah, he's when I got into it, was Saltbush Bill. And then as the comics progressed, it went to Wichita's Tribe, which is he's just absolutely fantastic Aboriginal comedy, excuse me. And he'd also do like professional charcoal drawings, and he'd do odd stories in his magazines about, might be just the history of corrugated iron or bullocks and whatever it was. And I just found it totally engrossing, and every copy that had come out, I'd read it back to back for a week. I found his Aboriginal artwork to be exceptional. And even as a young bloke, most of my friends were into Snake and Hago as I progressed into a young teenager, and it was just Jolliffe for me, and it did a lot for me. I learnt so many things as an adult too. Then I started, when I got a car, I was able to get out into the bush myself and skin rabbits and things, and I just learnt from this silly comic, really, and it really, people would say to me, you're quite knowledgeable out of the bush. Mate, I come from Footscray. I wouldn't tell them that, though.
Yeah.
Everything I read from Jolliffe. He
really
taught me so much about outback life, and that's a water tank, and that's a silo. I just knew things that I really had never seen in real life. I'd only seen in a book.
Well, since I've been reading up about him and listening to him, because the Australian Library, National Library, has got some audio archives of him talking about his life, he was saying that he would take cartoons, because he spent he ran away from home, or left home when he was about 15 at Sydney, to go and live in the bush and work in the bush. Had a bit of a rough time, and I think it was probably during the Depression too. He was a rabbiter, like lots of people were. He had to live off his own wits, live on the road. But he brought those drawings to the Bulletin, I think it was, and they'd say, whoa, because he'd have like fly-blown sheep and things, and he'd have
that's right.
Hanging on fences, and he'd have rabbits that had been skun, and their pelts would be hanging up and stuff like that. And he insisted on doing it with humour, but as honestly as he could.
Yeah, to me, the artwork was as funny. I'd look at the picture before you looked at the gag, really, and you'd laugh. Like the eye on the cow, he's got cold hands, or the dog's getting a kick in the bum and a look on its face, and the wife in the background. I mean, I don't know how you can get an expression on a chicken, but he did it. I mean, it's two eyes and a beak. But to me, they lived. Like you'd have an animated cartoon of a fictitious person, but the gum tree was like a dead set artistic rendering of a gum tree. with cartoons on around it, and I just found it, even to this day, very well. Even when I've gave you a few copies to have a look at, particularly the Arnhem Land ones. I mean, his drawings of escarpments would make any gallery, in my view. I mean, they were good quality artistic work, and he's generally recognised as a cartoonist. And that's why I asked you guys, have you ever heard this guy? Because I've never been able to find any history about him, or even with modern. You did put me onto the library, and I did have a listen. That was good.
Hey, well, what about the controversy about his drawings of Aboriginal people?
Yeah, well, that one edition that I was able to save, it was basically for the listeners, political correctness has stepped in probably in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm thinking it was about, and basically some Aboriginal people were complaining that made them look foolish, and obviously his love for the people, because as we consequently know, he no longer drew that Wichita's tribe anymore. He stepped away from it, but he did have his say in a very professional way, as is illustrated in that magazine. He just put his views across, and I found it quite sad, actually, because I didn't think it was insultive to the Indigenous people of Australia. I think it was very representative of traditional lifestyle, and that's what he talked about a lot, didn't he? He was really into the traditional lifestyle, not the stereotype that we see today, which by listening to those recordings on the National Archives, they were still stereotyped in the 70s, which is sad. I think also people used different language in days gone by. I mean, we change our language all the time depending on I don't know why we do. You know how we change the names of things? Yeah. We don't say disabled anymore, we say not abled or something like that. And so some of the language that Eric Jolliffe used in this interview, a little bit of what I'm about to play for you now, is dated, but it'll give you a bit of an indication of his drawings that he made in and around Arnhem Land and across the territory many years ago. That is not it. This is it.
I always tried to, as a cartoonist, to draw the Aborigines as they lived and not put them into contrived situations that didn't belong to their way of life. And this wasn't easy, of course, because the Aboriginal way of life is so simple that there are very few little things that you can pin a gag onto. For instance, old saltbush, there's always something new happening in the bush that you can work around to get a fresh angle. I found thinking up cartoon ideas for the Aboriginal way of life extremely difficult. And it was really a labour of love, because otherwise it wouldn't have been worthwhile. Sometimes, of course, I departed from reality just out of desperation to fill a deadline, but generally they were always doing something they'd be doing in their normal way of life. In fact, I had a couple of exhibitions in Arnhem Land, where I displayed my Aboriginal cartoons for all the tribal people to come in and look at, and they were very impressed with them. The thing that excited them was that everything was happening just exactly as it would do. The Aborigines, say for instance, that were stalking a kangaroo, they'd very quickly observe that the ones that were stalking the kangaroo were doing exactly as any Aboriginal would do. And this impressed them very much. In fact, I got Mountford, when I was with the National Geographic expedition, to ask them what they thought of my cartoons. I knew it was a waste of time me asking them, because their traditional politeness is such that they would say whatever they thought I wanted them to say, rather than what they actually felt. So he asked them what they thought of my cartoons, and came back and reported to me. He said the general consensus of opinion, Eric, is that your drawings are very accurate and true to life, and boy, can you draw a good sort. They caught the humour of the situation, of course, because it was the sort of thing And really, I suppose that when I'm drawing a cartoon for about Aborigines, that I'm really drawing for Aborigines, and I'm drawing a situation that they would understand perfectly well. The Aborigines got a very keenly, the tribal man that is, has got a keenly developed sense of humour that's lacking amongst the ones that have dwelt on the fringes of white society for a long time. There's too much bitterness there for humour, much in the way of humour.
That's Eric Jolliffe, and that's courtesy of the Australian National Library. Eric sat down and talked about his life, and we've been lucky enough to get some excerpts of that. Neville, you've got a favourite cartoon of Eric's.
Oh yes, I saw it many, many years ago, but it's stayed with me. When you mentioned that he could put an expression on a chicken's face, you prompted it. And the cartoon was a frillneck lizard that had gone to the head house and stolen an egg, and Ma had cornered it by a great big old gum tree. She's there with a wooden spoon, and she's waving it at the frillneck, and she's saying, "Right, now you go and put that right back." Doesn't sound funny, but if you saw the look, on the frillneck's face, with it clutching the egg with its two front arms, you'd know what I mean.
I reckon I can already imagine it. Hey, Neville, so Jolliffe's cartoons were pretty important to you too, were they?
Yep, they came out every week in, I think it was Post or Pix.
Pix, yeah.
Pix, that's it, every week, and yes, we got that magazine, and Jolliffe was the page that got studied the most.
Okay, mate, thanks for calling.
Cheers.
Lovely, bringing back memories. And with us right now, so look, if you've got memories about Eric, our phone number 1300 057 222. Join in. Lindsay Foyle is a former Deputy Editor of Bulletin, past President of the Australian Cartoonists Association, and above all, a wonderful cartoonist himself. Thanks for being with us, Lindsay.
Oh, you're welcome, Annie.
Can you tell us a little bit of Eric's history?
Oh, well, if he was alive today, he'd be 102 years old. He was born in England and came out to Australia, lived in Perth for a couple of years, and then spent most of his early life in Balmain. And he was there till he was 16.
And he was one of 12 kids, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, the family had 12 kids and no money.
Mm.
And he used to joke that, there was many a night where they'd pack up and move house in the middle of the night, so the debt collectors couldn't follow them.
He loved his mum. Reckon she had a great sense of humour. Wasn't all that partial to Dad?
No, he had a lot of fights with his dad, and it was the fighting with his father that eventually caused him to go bush.
And he says in his in this archival material that we've got hold of, he talks about the fact that he was naughty at school, pretty hopeless at school, and even when he went to art school, they put him down.
Well, the art teachers didn't think he had any talent, and many of them told him that he would never learn to draw, because he didn't start to draw properly until he was start learning until he was 21.
Did you meet him?
I met him a few times at Black and White Artists Club functions and a couple of art gallery openings of his cartoon work and things like that. And he was a tall, thin man, and well, when I say thin, he was slender.
Yeah.
Always immaculately dressed, always very polite and courteous to everybody. So.
Now, you were former deputy editor of Bulletin,
yes.
And Bulletin, of course, was where he, in the very early days, desperately wanted to be published. I hear from his memoirs that it was really hard work. He was a window cleaner, I think,
yes.
And he and another, all the other cartoonists would desperately try and get their pieces in.
Well, the Bulletin for over a century was the magazine or the newspaper as it was in the early days, where all the cartoonists wanted to be. Eric had been in the bush, and when he was 21, was in Angus and Robinson's reading a book and about how you could learn to draw, and he decided then that he wanted to be a cartoonist. So he took a job as a window cleaner while doing art classes. And it was across the road from the Bulletin, which was just a coincidence. And took him some years, but in 1934 they published his first, or the first time he got a cartoon published. So it took him about 5 years of hard work.
Now, I heard a yarn that he refused to depict Aboriginal people in a denigratory sort of way in the early days. What do you know about that?
Well, it was. If you go back into the old history books, the old copies of the books, the Bulletin and Smith's Weekly, the typical drawings of Aboriginals were of drunks and people who were living, pretty awful lives. And Eric wouldn't do that. He always drew them as strong, upright individuals. He never drew them drunk. He never drew them without respect. And the Bulletin and Smith's Weekly didn't like that because it was contrary to the way they liked to portray the Aboriginal community at that time.
So it was pretty brave because from what he says, he was broke, he was married, he was a window cleaner, and he was desperately trying to get his work accepted. So that was a very strong stand to make. Yeah, well,
it was a situation that developed. I mean, he'd seen Aboriginals when he was after the age of 16, where he spent about 5 years touring around the bush and Queensland and outback New South Wales, where he'd done anything he could on farms and properties, and he'd met a lot of Aboriginal people then, and he was quite impressed. But then when he was in the army during the Second World War, he'd spent some time in Arnhem Land, and he'd seen tribal Aboriginals up there, and he thought they were a pretty impressive crowd. And,
well, how did that criticism affect him? Did you speak to him at all about it?
Well, I did. I had a couple of conversations with him, quite serious conversations about in about 1980. He got attacked for racism, and he was extremely hurt because it was contrary to just about everything he believed in that, and he didn't believe his cartoons were racist because he wouldn't draw them in a derogatory fashion. But what he did do was contrast their lifestyle with white lifestyle. And while he might have drawn them in the bush and living a tribal life, he said they weren't getting bottles of milk delivered and they weren't sitting around watching TV. They're busy having a very good life.
Do cartoonists generally cop it from the politically correct brigade? Because part of your job is to be edgy, isn't it?
Yeah, well, just about every cartoonist will tell you that they'll get rubbished by somebody who has a particularly strong point of view. Bill Mitchell, who cartooned for The Australian, said that every time he got a criticism from the politically correct brigade, it made him want to draw something else more insulting.
It was sort of a badge of honour.
Yeah, but Eric wasn't like that because he just wanted to do his own work and just get on with it. And he didn't do too bad. I mean, he put out about 130 books of his cartoons, and by the early 70s, they'd had an accumulated sale of over 6 million copies, so that wasn't a bad effort. So
pretty good.
It must have been a few people liking it.
Well, what about his contribution to Australian cartooning, Lindsay?
I don't think anybody did a better job over the years that he cartooned. He was still drawing cartoons into his 90s when he drew. He was twice voted by the Cartoonists of Australia the best single gag cartoonist in the country. He was recognised by the people he worked with as one of the best cartoonists drawing leaves. And I don't think that's something that too many of them talk about. They said he could draw a gum leaf better than anybody.
Oh, that's great. Hey, so much joy talking to you, Lindsay Foyle. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome, Annie.
and for helping me out on this research. That's Lindsay Foyle, former Deputy Editor of Bulletin, past President of the Australian Cartoonists Association, and a pretty seriously good cartoonist himself, by the way. You can sort of check him out. I saw some of Lindsay's cartoons just today, brand new ones on the internet, so you can have a look in there. Here is Colleen, who knows Eric Jolliffe or knew him. G'day, Colleen. How are you?
Hello, Annie. I'm well, thanks.
So you were up close and almost personal with Eric Jolliffe.
Yeah, I was only a kid. I was about 13. And I'd gone on a cruise with my parents, and he was one of the guests on board ship, and he gave lessons. And he actually, why I sort of still think of him fondly, is he kept some of my drawings.
Did he?
Mm.
And what was he like? Was he funny?
No, not from memory.
Yeah.
No, he was, I guess at the time he was just busy walking around, checking everyone's drawings and telling people what they should be doing, and yeah, it was a different situation, I guess.
And he thought you were pretty good?
Well, I don't know. He did keep my drawings.
Are you still drawing?
Yeah, kinda. I do it for a living, and I don't draw for a living, but I work in the art sense, I guess.
Oh, in the art world.
Yeah,
well,
I work with glass and metal.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
We hope that this will get you back drawing.
I don't have time. My kids are pretty good drawers.
Well, that's all right then, as long as you've passed it on, Colleen.
I think I have.
Okay, thanks for calling.
No worries. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. 1300 057 222 is our number. Carl's still sitting here with us. That's great to hear, though, isn't it, Carl?
For me, being here this afternoon, I'm learning about, well, you say Eric, I always know him as Jolliffe.
Mm-hmm.
I knew nothing of the man. I'm learning a whole lot of it today, so it's good.
Well, you take some credit. You brought it to our attention. Now, here is Eric Jolliffe talking about those very early days, the first time that he, in fact, came to Arnhem Land.
Then, just at this stage, the war intervened, and I was a camouflage officer for the Air Force, and at quite a lot of the period I spent along the Arnhem Land coast. The northern Australian coastline into Western Australia and Arnhem Land was very wild, rugged country and inaccessible at this stage. There was no means of getting to it. There was no roads through it. And wartime meant that radar stations were all along the coast and airfields, little pocket airfields, which was my job to look after. And there I ran into the tribal Aboriginal for the first time. And of course, as I said earlier, I got wildly excited about him. It was a case of love at first sight, and I decided that I was going to be their artist as soon as the war was over. And that triggered off the Wichita tribe drawings. These I put into book form whenever I got a cheque for a book. After the war was over, I would whiz off to Arnhem Land, look up some of my old mates, like especially Bill Harney, who was a terrific authority, probably the best living authority on the Australian Aboriginal. Bill later was better known as Keeper of Ayers Rock. But Bill was a terrific bushman with a terrific memory. Bill had almost total recall, and he was a delight to travel around with. He and I used to travel around Arnhem Land together. He was then a patrol officer for Native Affairs Branch in the Northern Territory, and Bill was always investigating murders and Aboriginal trouble, you know. Bill's function, more or less, was to ascertain whether, say, for instance, a spearing was a tribal one or just simply a crime. In other words, if an Aboriginal, under direction from the elders, was exacting vengeance on some tribal wrongdoer, he was not responsible under English law, British law. So this meant that, particularly after the war, when Arnhem Land was really jumping, there were so many tribal killings and old scores and paybacks being settled that had been deferred by the war, and also young men to be initiated, because the tribes were broken up and shoved all over the place, due to the war. Arnhem Land was a really exciting place, and I consider I was very fortunate to see so much of it. I was with, as a guest of the 2 Arnhem Land expeditions run by the National Geographic and the Australian government, and these helped me a great deal in understanding the Aboriginal and his old way of life. Also, as a bushman, knocking around the bush in the old days when it was a pretty tough place, you lived more or less like a blackfella anyway. Things were so tough that you had to live on the country much like the Aborigines did, to supplement your diet a bit, knocking over wild game or anything that you could eat. And this helped me understand the problems of the black man, on the fringes of white society. But they are fascinating people, and some of the happiest years of my life were travelling along the Arnhem Land coast with Bill and a lot of his mates. Some wonderful characters up there.
Yes, there are some wonderful characters up here, and there certainly were, and here is in fact one of them. Ted Egan, how are you?
How you doing, Annie? I'm loving this.
Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear Jolliffe himself talking and rebutting without even being conscious of it, the stupid criticism of him. And he was a marvellous bloke, and I knew him very, very well, because when I came into the Native Affairs branch in 1952, I trained under Bill Harney, and so I met Jolliffe several times with Bill at places like Mullicabity and out in Arnhem Land, and had a great regard for him.
Well, we just had a call from Wes who believes that Eric Jolliffe spent a lot of time in Bullman in southeast Arnhem Land.
Yes, he did, because from Minaroo was Jack and Sandy Mackay were out there. They were also friends of Bill Harney's, yeah.
Out that way.
Yep.
So you hung out with him a bit?
Oh, I was only a young, patrol officer, and I was present with him many times. Had lots of very pleasant beers with Jolliffe, and he was a great humorist, as well as being the very dignified man that we just heard speaking on the radio. And he had a great respect for and an affection for Aboriginal people generally, and they equally loved him, because he was a good man to be around. He was polite and courteous, and he was skillful. He did make people laugh, and because Aboriginal humour is basically banana skin humour, people quickly understood everything Jolliffe did. But he was also a very, very skillful artist. In his annual book, he would have, say, 30 cartoons, and in the middle he'd have 6 or 7 pages of beautiful portraits of dignified old men and lovely character-full old women and lovely children smiling and happy and doing the things that they were doing naturally in those days. And he was a man of his times, and he would have adjusted a bit, but in those days it wasn't considered too wrong to present, as Mountford said, good sorts, voluptuous, bare-breasted girls not wearing much, because that was pretty much how it was. On the Tiwi Islands, 95% of women were bare-breasted in the 50s, and were totally natural about it. And they used to love to watch Jolliffe doing his cartoons, and especially sitting for the serious one where he would do it and give them a copy of it. And he's a great bloke.
And you saw him working, did you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, he was constantly working.
Hey, look, I think you'll just love this, both of you. This is Eric talking about a very amusing time when he was doing some drawing.
apart from cartooning, I got interested in, I considered the Aboriginal people a beautiful people. The old men with their magnificent faces and the piccaninnies and all of them. And I spent a lot of time sketching them. And I remember with the National Geographic expedition, I said to Mountford, who was the leader, I said, there's some terrific heads. We were on Melville Island at the time, and I said, there's some terrific heads here that I must draw when I can catch them at the right moment. And he said, Eric, he said, any moment's the right moment. They're all on the payroll of the expedition anyway, so any Aboriginal you see that you want to draw, just stop him and sit him down and draw him. And the first one I sat was an old man with a magnificent head. I stopped him, I sat him down on a box and started to draw him, and although he was a wonderful model in one direction, he was a most difficult man to draw. He fidgeted and grimaced and twisted and turned and crossed his legs and uncrossed his legs, and he became a thorough damn nuisance, and I was getting completely fed up with him. And just at about this stage, another Aboriginal came walking along this beach, Banjo Beach on Melville Island, and the old man called him over. He couldn't speak any English, so we hadn't had any conversation at all. He called the other chap over and he spoke to him in his native tongue. And the other man turned to me and said, Mr. Jolliffe, this man, when you stopped him, was on his way to the toilet. And so we broke up the drawing class for the time being, and when he came back he was completely relaxed and great help.
Different.
It's a good yarn, isn't it?
Yeah, we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously. The people who were critical of Jolliffe are urban activists and politically correct people. Correct. And they themselves put together the Sydney Push put together a wonderful piece called Barbecue Area, where they were Aboriginals lampooning the stupid whitefellas, and that was considered to be rip-roaringly funny, and it was funny, but they found Jolliffe's cartoons offensive.
Yeah.
And he's just then used the words like piccaninny and so on, and people say, oh, goodness, what an awful word to use. And yes, it is nowadays, and Jolliffe wouldn't use it if he was around today. But everyone called Aboriginal people natives in Darwin in those days, and it wasn't an insult, it was what you called them. And they made jokes about themselves. That little story is just so typical of Aboriginal life, where people were constantly laughing at often the mishaps of others. I remember when I was at Yuendamu in the 50s, there was an old blind bloke, and they used to call him Bumper. And kids were given the job each day of leading Bumper around. He would hold one end of a boomerang, and some kid would be given the job of leading him round. And the kids used to delight in leading old Bumper over, and so that he'd fall into a little trench. And everyone knew that as sort of a party piece, and when it happened, everybody, including Bumper, would laugh his head off. And, so it's total banana skin stuff. Okay,
just hang on a sec, will you, Ted? We've got Craig online. G'day, Craig. What are your memories?
Oh, look, I remember as a teenager reading those cartoon books, and as Ted said, the amazing drawings he did of the Aboriginal people, especially the children. They just looked so happy. And that sort of drove me to come to the Territory in the 80s to have a look. But unfortunately, by then, you couldn't find an area that was like what he drew, the way they lived, etc. It had sort of gone by the by, but it was still very interesting to see that a lot of those characters, you could see the character in a lot of the faces of the Aboriginals as you walked around in the 80s. You could still see what Jolliffe had captured in those books. But Ted's right, they do have a great sense of humour, very slapstick. They love that sort of stuff. But I just remember the actual portraits that he did of the Aboriginal people and the kids. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Really beautiful. In fact, thanks for calling, Craig. If you jump on our blog at www.abc.net.au/Darwin or Alice Springs and click on radio, you can see we've just managed to get one beautiful drawing of a young hunter, and a couple of the fantastic cartoons to just give you a bit of an idea, and it'll jog your memory if you don't think you know Eric Jolliffe. Ted, I'm so glad you could join us this Arvo.
Yes, it brings back some very happy memories of a Butte bloke, and I particularly enjoyed Lindsay Foyle's assessment of Jolliffe because he was a Butte bloke and very dignified man, totally respectful of Aboriginal people, and one to be remembered with great affection.
Thank you, Ted.
Thanks, Annie.
Ted Egan, who got to know Eric Jolliffe when he was on the ground in the Territory many, many years ago. And by the way, just got a text from Dallas. Yes, Dallas, some of Jolliffe's work was quite erotic. Very beautiful women that he was illustrating too. And look, what would we do without you, Carl?
Oh, probably a lot more.
Well, you've introduced this man's world to me, and as he introduced the Territory to you.
He did, and like our last caller was in, it prompted me to come to the Territory and see what it was about too. And you can still see the Melaleuca and escarpments that Jolliffe could see. They're there, but obviously things have changed in lifestyles for both the black and white cultures in Australia. And I just felt his works did so much for me. Yeah, I couldn't experience that with my circle of friends. Oh, bloody Aussie shit, excuse the French. But it's good to see that people up here obviously appreciated the work that he did do.
Yeah. Well, good on you.
Thanks.
And thanks for coming in, Carl.
Do it again.
And by the way, there's still a lot of really beautiful people to draw around the place, are there not? We've got to keep our sense of humour.